Hello and thank you for tuning into the New Orchard Show. In the last 2 decades, concerns have been raised about the declining quality of education and educational outcomes in Australia, reflecting wider trends observed across majority of Western nations. Despite substantial elevation of funding into key areas of education, key performance indicators provide ample evidence that student achievement is trending in a negative direction. Between 2012 and 2022, total state and federal government spending on school education in Australia increased by a whopping 43%. However, in the same period, Program for International Student Assessment reported declining results by 3%. In the 2018 PISA study, Australian students ranked 16th in reading, 29th in mathematics, and 17th in science globally, continuing a trend of gradual decline. One of the wealthiest, most peaceful, most prosperous countries in the world, truly a lucky country, got outperformed by China in position number 1, Singapore in position number 2, Estonia in position number 5, and countries like Poland in position number 10. Why is that? What's causing this decline in performance? In the last few years, debates have emerged regarding the role of merit in educational institutions. Take QUT, for example, the famous Queensland University of Technology, an institution that faced a fair amount of criticism for removing references to merit from its hiring policy. The clever administrators at QUT decided to replace these hiring policies with, let me quote from the website here, more inclusive suitability assessment that accounts for additional factors such as gender and ethnic background. It's an interesting line of thinking, assuming that merit works only for a specific gender or a specific ethnicity. In the last decade, a lot of noise has been made with educational leaders and policymakers advocating for all kinds of reforms that pivot more towards evidence-based teaching practices. The calls for some type of reform also come from Aboriginal leaders and activists. Noel Pearson, for example, has criticised the Australian Education Union for opposing reforms like direct instruction and phonics-based reading, which have been shown to benefit First Nations children. Preparing for this episode, I had a good look at some of the results from international academic competitions, in particular science Olympiads, where Australian kids have truly achieved notable successes across different categories. Let me list a couple of them. In 2022, at the International Earth Science Olympiad, Australian students secured 4 gold, 3 silver and 1 bronze medal. Edmund Wu from Knox Grammar School being a particular standout, achieving the highest individual score globally. The same year at the International Physics Olympiad, Freddie Yip, also from Knox Grammar School, won gold, adding to a pretty impressive Australian tally of metal, alongside 2 silver and 2 bronze medals. In 2023, at the International Olympiad in Informatics held in Hungary, Jerry Lee, representing James Roos Agricultural High School in New South Wales, secured a silver medal, demonstrating his exceptional skills in computer programming. Are you noticing a little pattern forming here? Edmund Wu, Freddie Yip, Jerry Lee. In recent years, many top-performing Australian students in international academic Olympiads, especially STEM, have been of Asian descent. You have to ask yourself if these students are successful because of the system, because of the effectiveness of national programs in preparing them for global competition, or despite that system that's not necessarily working in their advantage. There's a broader trend here in play that goes well beyond Australia. Students from Asian backgrounds across Western countries excel in highly competitive academic environments. I think we can attribute that to different factors, including strong family emphasis on education, rigorous study habits and discipline, increased participation in additional academic programs, as well as impact of cultural values that prioritize academic achievement and solid work ethic. If the educational system was optimally configured and optimally run, it would produce high achievement across the board independent of additional cultural filters. But as the data shows, it does not do that despite the never-ending increases in funding. We once saw education as the great equalizer, a universal ladder that anyone could use to climb to success. In present day and age, it would appear that education is a system designed to produce compliant workers instead of independent and courageous thinkers. What happened, and more importantly, can the state of play be changed? My guest today is just the right person to help us map the sequence of events that led us to this point, and hopefully leave us with some actionable insights that will help us navigate the educational maze. Dr. Kevin Donnelly is a conservative author and a commentator. Since first warning about the dangers of politically correct language control and groupthink in the mid-1990s, Dr. Kevin Donnelly has established himself as one of Australia's foremost culture war warriors. Kevin is also one of Australia's leading education commentators, a vocal defender of Western civilization, Judeo-Christianity, and a classical liberal education against the destructive and nihilistic impact of neo-Marxist-inspired ideology. He writes regularly for the print and digital media, including The Australian, The Daily Telegraph, The Catholic Weekly, Quadrant, The Australian Spectator, and the London-based Conservative Woman. Over the years, Kevin Donnelly has published a number of books, and some of them include Defend the West, The Culture of Freedom, Wake Up to Woke, It's Time Australia, Cancel Culture, and The Left's Long March, Christianity Matters in These Troubled Times, How Political Correctness is Destroying Australia, How Political Correctness is Destroying Education, and Taming the Black Dog and the Culture of Freedom. I've got a lot of questions for Kevin, so let's just dive in. Mr. Donnelly, you have been quite vocal about the inadequacies of the current Australian curriculum. What, in your view, are the three most significant flaws in the current system that need immediate attention?
One is it's overcrowded. I mean, I co-chaired the review of the national curriculum in 2014, and it became obvious very quickly that it was overcrowded. And so you're looking at a curriculum from prep to year 10 in all the major subjects. And it's very hard, especially in primary school, for teachers to cover it. And if they try and do everything, it becomes very superficial. What the Americans call a mile wide and an inch deep. So very superficial. So overcrowded is one thing. The other thing, and we'll probably talk about later, is it's very, what I used to call politically correct. People now talk about being woke. So it's very cultural left, put it that way, in terms of the teaching practice, the teaching style or pedagogy, and also the curriculum, especially in subjects like history and English. So it's very woke, it's overcrowded, and also it's almost impossible to implement for teachers. It really is the way it's put together, and the different states and territories copy it generally. There are three areas that teachers have to look at. One is what they call the general capabilities, like being creative, working in teams. The other is the actual outcome statements, or what we used to call the content. And the third is the curriculum perspectives. And there are three of them: Asia, Indigenous, Australian, and Torres Strait Islander, and sustainability. And that again just means it's almost impossible to cover everything, and it becomes a checklist mentality rather than teachers being subject experts and students getting a thorough grounding in essential knowledge and understanding and skills. It's more tick the boxes, very bureaucratic.
That's very interesting. You've mentioned political correctness slash wokeness. How do you perceive the impact of this political correctness on education? And can you provide examples where you believe it has negatively influenced teaching or curriculum development?
I'm getting old, and when I went to school many years ago, if you look at the 50s, 60s, even the 1970s, especially school education, teachers were there to teach. They weren't there to indoctrinate or to force their own views on students. And they were supposed to be impartial and objective. And if there was a contentious issue, their responsibility was to present all the different arguments and give the students the ability to weigh the evidence. But since the mid 70s, it's really changed all that quite radically. So what it has become is now very much what I call indoctrinating children with cultural Marxism. That's what it can be traced back to, even though many teachers aren't aware of that. So it's very progressive, very woke. I mean, one issue that was obvious during the whole debate about the Indigenous voice to Parliament was the argument that the First Fleet was an invasion in 1788, and that the arrival of the British led to genocide, and there was nothing positive or nothing to celebrate. And we see that every year with Australia Day, where quite a few activists argue that there's nothing to celebrate. We should be ashamed of our nation. It's a bit like original sin. Every generation should feel guilty about what happened in 1788. Now, that's one example. And Geoffrey Blaney, our historian, talks about a black armband view of history. So it's very negative, very nihilistic. Another example would be radical gender ideology. So for many years now in primary, even in kindergarten, children are being taught that gender or sexuality are not God given or biologically determined, that gender in particular is a social construct, and that they should have the freedom, children as young as 7 or 8 or 10, they should have the freedom to identify anywhere on the spectrum of being LGBTIQA plus, which is that kind of rainbow alliance of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, etc. And the third one would be climate change. And I mean, there's no doubt the climate does change over time. The argument is what's causing that. Rather than present that argument in a balanced way, students are taught that it's all about man-made carbon emissions. And I've seen 10, 14-year-old girls crying, crying on demonstrations against climate change. And when they've been asked, why are you crying? They say, we can never have children because the world's about to end in 2030. So what's happening, rather than education being something positive and life affirming, it's all very negative, very nihilistic. We invaded, we committed genocide. If you're white, or whether it's from Europe or the UK, you're guilty of white supremacism. Uh, Children are taught that men are misogynist, that society is structurally racist, sexist, homophobic, transgender. So the picture that presents to young people is there's nothing there really to hold on to. And I've written about this for the papers. It doesn't surprise me that so many young people suffer anxiety, uh, stress, even self-harm and youth suicide, because it's a pretty bleak, nihilistic view of the world in which they're growing up in.
Yeah, it would be very hard to disagree with that. You've mentioned that 1970s was the pivotal point where these progressive changes have accelerated. What specifically happened in 1970s that triggered this cascading effect?
Yeah, people talk about the Cultural Revolution in the late 60s, early 70s. And a lot of people have written about this. I've sort of written about it for 40 years. But if you look at what was happening across the Western world in particular, in Europe, United Kingdom, America, Australia, New Zealand, there was what they call a cultural revolution. Now, whether it was Woodstock, and most young people don't understand about Woodstock, but it was the amazing coming together of youth culture. At the time, what were called hippies, there was whether it was marijuana or LSD or mescalanto, there was an upsurge in drugs. It was the time of the anti-Vietnam War moratoriums. Germaine Greer, the Australian, had written The Female Eunuch. So there was a rise of feminism, the music, the whole culture was one of rebelling against authority. Now, in education, what that meant was the more idea of a liberal education where there was competition, meritocracy, there were key subjects that everybody had to learn. That was all turned upside down because the argument was, and there are various people who were pushing this, and I can talk about some of those if you like, but the argument became one in terms of English teaching in particular, that standard English was wrong, teaching the classics was wrong, and with the impact of what they called critical theory, whether that was coming from Foucault or Derrida, the French, in terms of postmodernism, deconstructionism, or even going back to Paulo Freire, the Marxist from South America, who talked about critical literacy. The whole point of English teaching was to question authority, overthrow capitalism, radically change society. So it started to happen during the early to mid 70s, and that's generally accepted now that there was quite a revolutionary change, especially in schools and universities. Some of you or some of your listeners might remember the time, I think it was 1968, the Sorbonne University in Paris. There were student riots where they took to the streets. In America, on a lot of college campuses, there were moratoriums, there were demonstrations. Students, radical students, argued that you couldn't teach about Western culture anymore. It had to be deconstructed in terms of power relationships, especially white supremacism. And there was a whole, what we now call the Black Lives Matter movement, but there was that whole upsurge in terms of critical race theory as well.
Given your views on educational standards, what do you think about the role of standardized testing in Australia? How does it help or hinder the diagnostic process of educational progress?
When I went through school in the 60s, there was no standardised testing. And we had what was called school-based curriculum development. Now, what that meant was, and this was happening during the 70s and 1980s, the first time students hit or sat an external competitive examination was year 12. When I went to school, it was called matriculation in Victoria. Then it became the high school certificate. Uh, so there was no sense of measurement in terms of at primary level or secondary, lower and middle. There was no attempt to actually measure how well students were going in terms of literacy, numeracy. And the research is clear that if students are having trouble, you need to pick that up earlier. And in fact, if it's reading, you need to know when they're in grade 1 or 2 or level 1 or 2 that there's an issue. So the whole debate back then, especially from the teaching union, the Australian Education Union, was to best way to raise standards was to spend more money. So if you invest more, if there are fewer teachers, smaller classes, more resources, standards would automatically improve. That never happened because there was nothing to measure. There was no real way of knowing what was happening. So it began in Victoria, New South Wales. They introduced the idea of standardised testing, and the Australian Council of Educational Research had responsibility for a lot of that. And then under the Howard government, I think it was David Kemp, the Federal Education Minister, we moved to national testing, what they call now NAPLAN, National Assessment, Literacy and Numeracy. Now, the good side is that for once you actually can work out what's happening to students as they move from lower primary, middle primary, lower secondary. You can actually say, well, look, they're at this level, they haven't achieved it yet, they're at risk. You can say that some schools are actually doing very well, some are not doing very well. And I've always argued that that's a good thing because then you can identify what are the characteristics of the better schools that are getting the better results. And hopefully you can learn from those to help the schools that are underperforming do better. Now, We moved from no testing. Some people argue now we have too much standardised testing. I don't agree with that. But there's an argument there that some schools will simply teach to the test. And it's really just a standardised test. There's not a lot of content there. It's more about basic skills. So if that's all that's being taught, it's a pretty superficial education.
This is quite puzzling, actually. If we try to zoom out and look at the people who are in charge of their educational institutions, people who call the shots around what the educational programs are, and people who set goals and objectives, surely they must see that moving away from discipline and merit is not a good game. It's not a game we can play for a particularly long time. I mean, at the end of the day, we can ignore reality, but can we ignore the consequences of ignoring reality? It doesn't work that way. So the writing's on the wall here, and it's pretty clear to see how this is going to play out given enough time. You have access to some senior stakeholders in the establishment, so I'm curious to hear from you about what does that conversation look like in the top tiers of educational leadership in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, it varies. Education is a very divided area, and I'm talking about school education, also what I call teacher training. Some people call it teacher education. But in terms of training beginning teachers, so when I was at university, we did we did an undergraduate degree. I majored in English and politics. Then we did a diploma of education 1 year. Uh, Primary was different. They had teachers' colleges back in the day. But we then moved to teacher education being part of the universities. And when that happened, they really, I'd argue, and others have, became captured by academics who had never taught in a school, had never had the experience of having to deal with a class of 30 students on a Friday afternoon. And many of them were academics. Michael Gove, the English Conservative politician, he was Secretary of State Education. He makes the point that a lot of the students who went to university during the 60s and early 70s then became academics and teachers in the 80s and 90s. And because they had that cultural left or cultural Marxist view, where competition was wrong, meritocracy was wrong, and this goes back to the sociology of education and a cultural Marxist interpretation. And the argument, and I read all of this when I did the master's and then the doctorate, the PhD in curriculum. A lot of the left-wing academics argued, and it actually goes right back to Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, during the 50s. What they argued was that if we call it traditional schooling, reinforced capitalist hierarchy. So Althusser, the French Marxist, talks about the ideological state apparatus. The argument was, and it was accepted and commonly argued in teacher education, the argument was that the way capitalism reinforced itself, reproduced itself, was either through violence, or else through the ideological state apparatus, which refers to schools, universities, church, family, the media, intermediate organisations. So what happened in education, especially school education, and the teacher union, the Australian Education Union, argued this again and again and again over 20, 30 years, that the curriculum must be turned upside down. So it's all about collaboration, about critiquing capitalism, about empowering students. And a lot of that goes back to Paulo Freire, who argued that if you wanted to overthrow capitalism, you begin with education. And a good example of that is Joan Kirner in Victoria, who was the Minister for Education and then Premier. Joan Kirner argued at a Fabian Society meeting, I think in the early 80s, that education, schools must become a vehicle to overthrow capitalism and to bring about the socialist revolution. And the way you do that is to get away from academic subjects, competition, meritocracy, and it's all about empowering, liberating, and deconstructing or analysing, offering a critique. And that's been a very, very powerful influence in England, America, Australia as well.
In a well-functioning free market economy that's not propped up by government or subject to excessive and oppressive regulation, that tends to destroy choice and tends to create this total conformity, a system technically should self-diagnose and then self-correct. But this isn't what we're seeing. We are now at a point where homeschooling is no longer a fringe modality, with more and more parents opting for it. Parents who take time to look into public education and private education realize that things are not optimally set up for quality outcomes. As you also said earlier, there's so much ideological contamination in the system. What's being packaged to parents does not seem to appeal as much as it used to. And this is particularly noticeable in the United States with a huge shift towards homeschooling. It just looks like parents had enough and seek alternatives to mainstream, realizing that the systems as they are today can't prepare the children for the future. What do you think is happening?
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I mean, a good example would be Florida with DeSantis. And I think maybe 2, 3 years ago, parents mobilised in Florida against radical gender ideology, but also against critical race theory in places like Virginia. So, in the Republican states in particular, and this is one reason why DeSantis won, became governor, was because parents were arguing, as you said, enough is enough. We want our kids to go to school to be educated, not to be indoctrinated with groupthink. Uh, Homeschooling is on the rise in places like, especially in Queensland. Uh, but the movement in America is very big in terms of impacting on government. One reason Trump is now the president elect and has won both houses of Congress and also the popular vote is because some of the surveys show that parents are fed up with their kids not being educated properly. Now, it's fascinating in Victoria, we've had a move, and in fact around Australia, a move towards what we're calling a classical liberal education. And I think you've spoken to Con Bazookas and others who are involved with that. They set up the Classical Education Society. I've organised 3 national forums about that. One in Melbourne 2 years ago, Sydney last year at Campion College, and Brisbane this year, and we'll probably do another one next year. But we had about 90, 100 people register for Brisbane. And earlier, mid-year, probably this year, I went to Adelaide, spoke to 200 parents who want to start a school. So people, not just Victoria, people around Australia, whether it's Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Toowoomba, Wagga, people are starting schools because they're so concerned. Plus, we've had the upsurge in homeschooling. Maybe 10 years ago, the problem with homeschooling, most of the resources were from America. But now it's happening that there are a lot of resources being made that are styled to Australia, which is great. So parents are starting to wake up to the issue. The problem there is that a lot of parents don't have the choice. I mean, it often depends on where you live. It often depends on whether you can pay school fees. It often depends on whether you have the networks or the expertise. I mean, homeschooling, for example, can be very, very challenging, especially if you don't have other families joining in with you.
Mm-hmm.
But just on that point, if I could,
Sure.
the other thing there, one of the big arguments over the last 40, 50 years has been how do you teach reading? how do you teach little children how to read? We had what was called a whole language approach for many, many years. And it came in during the late 60s, early 70s. The idea there was that learning how to read the printed word was the same as learning how to listen or how to speak. Now, learning how to listen or how to speak for 99% of children is pretty easy in a sense that they pick that up from their parents and their siblings, and it's something that happens, if you can say, naturally. Whereas learning to read the printed word is totally unnatural. It doesn't happen by accident or intuitively. But because we moved to this whole language approach, which was almost very sort of Rousseauian, the idea that children grow naturally towards knowledge and they can pick it up, look and guess, work it out from the pictures, failed miserably. And we've had generations of young people, especially boys, leave school functionally illiterate. The good news over the last 2 years is people in the bureaucracy in government have woken up so that New South Wales, Victoria, they've all argued now we need to get back to phonics and phonemic awareness and a more structured approach to teaching reading. That kind of move back to sanity and common sense, it's only the beginning. It hasn't really happened yet the way we teach English or history or mathematics or science. So there's still a long way to go, but I think people are starting to wake up.
Would you say that these negative trends you have been articulating so well for us over the last 23 minutes have something to do with how quickly the society has secularized at all? Do you think that has an impact?
I mean, that's quite a good discussion to have. And I know talking to people who've set up these classical liberal schools, a lot of them are Christian. And so there's a very strong faith element. Now, it can become complicated, but if I give an example, the way they now teach reading, and they have for 20, 30 years, and I looked at this when I was doing the doctorate, it used to be that you read a book, a play, a novel, a short story, a poem, and you read it to try and work out what was being written by the author. The argument then changed to there was no author. The author is dead, as they argued, and reading became very subjective. So each person interpreted the text in whatever way they felt was the best. So if you had 20 kids reading Shakespeare's Macbeth, there was no inherent meaning, no objective meaning. It was up to you to work out what was happening, and it became subjective, very relativistic. Now, that has a profound impact because if there are no absolutes, there is no truth. There's something like the Bible, the Word of God, has no divine meaning. It's simply a text to be analysed and deconstructed in terms of power relationships. So there's an element here within society, and people like Roger Scruton debates this quite, or argues this quite a lot, and also an Italian, Augusto Del Noce, who is really one of the most prescient and insightful cultural critics of modernity. They argue, as does Solzhenitsyn, if you lose that sense of the absolute, and it actually goes back to ancient Greece and Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, if there is no sense of truth, no sense of being more able to approximate, get closer to the truth of things, if it's all subjective or relative, then, as Solzhenitsyn said, there is no God. And as T.S. Eliot argues, once a culture loses religion, any sense of divine, it's on the short road to chaos.
All right, let's move on because we've got quite a lot of questions to get through. Based on your review with Kenneth Wiltshire, what are the key recommendations for curriculum reform that you feel would address the issues you've identified? In 2014, Christopher Pyne, who was the Australian Education Minister, appointed Kevin Donnelly and Kenneth Wiltshire to undertake a review of the Australian curriculum. This review was set in the context of a broader debate about the direction of education in Australia, focusing on content, values, and educational outcomes. There were three key objectives of the review. Number one, assess the effectiveness, independence, and balance of the Australian curriculum. Number two, ensure that the curriculum provides a robust framework for student learning and achievement. And number three, look into the development process and the content of the curriculum to see if it aligns with national educational goals. There's a couple of findings that came out of this process. They recommended a stronger focus on Western civilization, literature, and Australia's Judeo-Christian heritage, which they felt was underrepresented. They also suggested a move towards more explicit teaching methods over what they perceived as overly progressive or inquiry-based learning. They called for more transparency in how the student progress is assessed and reported, advocating for clearer standards. While advocating for some level of teaching autonomy, they emphasized the need for a curriculum that sets clear knowledge expectations. They highlighted the importance of involving the broader community, including parents, in the educational process to ensure that curriculum reflects community values and expectations. Now, this review was met with mixed reactions like everything. Critics argued that it leaned too heavily towards a conservative educational philosophy, potentially at the expense of inclusivity, critical thinking, and modern educational science. On the other side, proponents believed it would restore balance and rigor to the curriculum.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we argued, and we disagreed on how much, but we argued to cut it right back. And I argued that if you say the national curriculum is 100% of what schools should be doing, I said cut it back to 60%. So in a school week, there might be 3 days, say, where they have to follow the national curriculum. But the other 2 days, and they'd vary this and swap it around, they would be free to have school-based curriculum development. So I argued one way would be to cut it right back, to give schools and teachers greater flexibility and greater time. We also argued that you get back to teachers as teachers. There's a lot of research about the importance of memorization, of rote learning. Now, whether it's poetry or ballads or times tables or doing mental arithmetic or learning dates, you have to memorize that in terms of, so it becomes automatic. And then it becomes part of your, I think, what they call the sort of the long-term memory, where it's automatically, you can draw on it. If you don't have that memorization and rote learning, it's very difficult to understand or read or be able to cope with new information. So if you're doing an algorithm, or if you're reading a poem or whatever it might be, if you don't have that long-term memory where all the foundation has been achieved, it's almost impossible to really do what is in front of you because you're always kind of second guessing yourself. I mean, a perfect example is a lot of boys, because they've never been taught how to read properly, they get to middle school, year 9, year 10, and they're asked to read something and they stumble over the words. They can't really sound it out, or it's not automatic. I mean, if I say 5 5 25, read this, and I go to the Victoria Market every Saturday and I've got to know all the shopkeepers. Some of them joke they can't employ anybody under 30 because if you've got 10 people lined up all wanting to buy stuff, you can't write it all down. Or if you do, you have to add it up very quickly, if you follow me. And you can't get out your iPad or your phone and just type it in, add it up. So a lot of young people don't have any mental arithmetic. They can't work it out. But more importantly, a lot of young people just don't have that ability because the long-term memory hasn't been. It's like computing. If you're talking about software and hardware. You have to hardwire the brain with all of this information, data, facts, so it becomes automatic, and then you can have the energy and the ability to cope with new information. Now, the other point there is what, and I've written about this for Quadrant, is what E.D. Hirsch Jr. called cultural literacy. So when you talk about standardised testing and that plan, it's important to know whether kids can read or add up, but it's equally, if not more important, to know if they're culturally literate. So if I was to say that's his Achilles heel, if I was to say he met his Waterloo, uh, if you've never studied history or read the Iliad and the Odyssey, you have no idea what I'm talking about. I mean, there are many, many examples of cultural literacy. I mean, some of it's funny. You know, back a Burke is a uniquely Australian expression about the outback out there. Uh, in Victoria, we say more trouble than a Werribee duck because the Werribee is where the sewerage farm is. So if the ducks land, they're in a lot of trouble. You know, some sayings are specific, but if you're reading a newspaper or listening to something on YouTube or watching the news, there are often references. If you don't know, you don't understand what's happening or what's being argued. I mean, you know, things like the fall of the Berlin Wall or what happened under Mao Zedong. A lot of young people, there was a survey, a lot of young people couldn't see what was wrong with communism. And they didn't really know why a liberal Western democracy was any better because they've never been taught history about the dangers of of communism, whether it's Lenin or Stalin or Mao or Pol Pot or Mao Zedong. So again, there's a broader question here, not just of memorizing things in terms of the basics, hardwiring the brain in terms, as I said, but there's also this cultural literacy, which is critically important.
All right, let's pivot a little bit and talk about teacher autonomy and accountability. How can we balance giving teachers more autonomy in their teaching methods, but ensure they remain accountable for educational outcomes? What's the right balance there?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult one to answer in the sense if you had good teacher training, whether it was when I went through, we had 1 year DipEd, Diploma of Education. That all changed very quickly to a 2 year Masters in Education. And part of the reason there is that the academics in universities want to have more students longer because they get paid more and it's more income. I mean, I'd cut it back to a 1 year Diploma of Education, not 2 years, number one. I'd also hold teacher training accountable. There've been a number of reviews about teacher training, but nothing's really changed. So I would actually say let's look very closely at what you're teaching in terms of classroom management, in terms of pedagogy, etc. And if you're not doing it properly, you don't get funded. Simple as that. Or else you rank the universities in terms of those that are good, those that are dodgy, to use that word. I mean, teachers need to know what works. So, in a sense, you can't just make it up. Whether it's classroom discipline, whether it's teachers being subject experts, whether it's teachers being motivated, committed, a lot of those things are essential. So, the way around it would be to say, well, okay, teacher training should be doing all of that. Once they get into school, one way is to mentor beginning teachers with those teachers who have been proven to be effective and successful. And I don't mean you have like currently there's the body responsible for certification and of teachers, APSL. but they've listed hundreds and hundreds of indicators, criteria, which is all not effective, put it that way. So I'd simplify it, cut it right back, make teaching more like an apprenticeship. So they might spend 2 or 3 years in university, but they also have to spend, maybe 4 or 5 months in a school, if not longer, learning from mentors how to teach and how to manage students. And then there needs to be, and this is the question with the whole movement. There is one argument in America from libertarians that you set up charter schools and they have total autonomy. Uh, you have parental vouchers. So you let the market work. So if parents have a $5,000 voucher, they'll choose the school that they think is best able to teach their child. And parents, there's a network where parents always talk, uh, whether it's around the barbecue or when they're meeting socially. So one way, and I'm not too sure whether that would actually work, and there are a lot of issues there that would need to be thought through. But on one extreme, you could say, well, look, market driven totally. How do we get rid of all the stuff that's not working? How do we make sure teachers are effective? How do we make sure the content, what's being taught, is rigorous? Charter schools, parental vouchers, and let the market decide. Now, there are issues there. The other way is to actually give schools a degree of flexibility and autonomy. So, with a particular school, they employ their staff. It doesn't come from head office. They employ their staff. They have to teach the 60%, that's compulsory, to all schools. But the other 2 days a week, they have the freedom to really put their curriculum focus on what they want to do. And you would need some kind of overall accountability. Now, whether it's testing or year 12 exams, as we currently have, that would have to be thought through. But yeah, it's hard to know where that's working effectively. I mean, in America, some of the states have been having charter schools for a fair while. In England, I got to know Chris Woodhead, who was what they call Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Schools, and they have Ofsted, which does this kind of overview. But the problem with Ofsted is, in some ways, it became captured by the cultural left. So there's a real danger here, and this is the conundrum. If you say you don't have all schools independent, flexible, autonomous, we give them the freedom, but we have an overarching umbrella where we have accountability. If that umbrella gets captured, then you're in trouble.
Was education in Australia always set up as a business, or is that a relatively recent development?
Well, certainly at the tertiary level, it's now a business. At the tertiary level, it has been for many years. I mean, when I did matriculation in 1969, I think only maybe 15 or 20% of young people went to university. And back then there were three in Victoria, Melbourne, Monash and Latrobe. Now, we probably have over 100 colleges, tertiary universities, colleges, and beginning with, certainly Labor government federally was very big on this, and they still are. They want to increase the percentage of young people who go to university. They want to increase the percentage of young people finishing school. Now, there's a limit to what the benefits of that. I mean, I've always argued not everybody should go to university. Number one, they don't have the ability or the intelligence, and you're not allowed to say that anymore. But not everyone is going to be a brain surgeon or a lawyer or an engineer or a musician or a creative person, an artist. So I don't believe everybody should go to university. But the last, say, 10, 20 years in Australia, well, basically since the Dawkin reforms under the Whitlam government, it's become a business. They've been corporatised, put it that way. Schools, to a degree, we have about 34% of students going to non-government schools, Catholic and independent. And some of those schools, they're more concerned about getting numbers. So it's all about enrolment, increasing enrolments. It's all about, and when you read some of the marketing blurb from these schools, there's nothing about beauty or truth or wisdom or an education which is intellectually rigorous, morally grounded, spiritually, emotionally enriching. It's all about the resources, the success at year 12, the results. Uh, it goes on, but it's all about this corporatisation. That's the issue. And that's why we've talked about it. A lot of parents and teachers are starting their own classical liberal schools. And when you read some of the schools, their web pages, they're very upfront. They say, we're here to teach virtues, beauty, truth, wisdom. We're not here to sort of market ourselves as 21st century learning, progressive, new age, collaborated, negotiated goals, all the jargon they use. So it's starting to change, but not quickly enough. Uh, so there is a fear, I think, in education more broadly, to answer your question. Yes, it's become more about the money and growing enrolments rather than, and when I reviewed the national curriculum, I kind of put forward 4 or 5 approaches. It's no longer about enculturation, which is the one I argue we need urgently, which goes back to T.S. Eliot and Michael Oakeshott, the philosopher, and others. The purpose of education should be about enculturation, which is passing on from each succeeding generation what Oakeshott calls the conversation that began centuries ago and which is ongoing. And I'm sure you might know Edmund Burke wrote about this, that the whole point, and did Matthew Arnold, the whole point of culture is that it's a contract between those who are gone, those who are dead, those who are living, and those who are yet to come. So there's that need for the continuity, which we've totally lost.
Yes, absolutely correct. We have lost that continuity almost completely. I've asked you that question about the business nature of education, as I've been thinking about the driving incentives that, in a way, are comparable to medical industrial complex, where the incentives are designed mostly for business outcomes and not often enough for health outcomes. And I see parallels to that in education as well, especially now in such a saturated ecosystem of universities and colleges. Anyway, let's move on, as I'd love to ask you about parental involvement. My line of thinking here is that we got to a point where parents essentially thought that they can outsource all of the responsibility for education to institutions, public or private, and not really be involved in any continuous and meaningful way. Of course, I'm generalizing here, but that seems to be the trend. So in what ways can parental involvement be increased to really improve educational outcomes? And what structural changes do you recommend to facilitate this?
Yeah, the problem there is we've gone totally the other way. I mean, many parents have abrogated their responsibility to raise children. Now, some of that is not their fault. I mean, the cost of living, as we all know, and thank God, I'm relatively well off, so it's not an issue I have to face, and our kids have all grown up. But to have a young family now, it's often uh, urgent that both parents work to have 2 incomes because the cost of living is so high. When we had our children and the generation of people that I grew up with, all of our friends, all the mothers when we had children were at home. So during the even up 70s, 80s, mothers were housewives, or women were mothers and housewives. what that meant was, and all the research is showing this, the first 3 years of a child's life are incredibly critical in terms of the need to be nurtured and loved and cared for by the mother. Now, it troubles me greatly that I heard Jason Clare, the Federal Education Minister, in an interview yesterday, boast about the fact that the Labor government was going to put millions and millions more into kindergartens and early childhood care. So more and more parents can put their babies and children into kindergarten or childcare. And the research, as I said, is obvious. Those first 3 or 4 years are critical. And putting babies and children into childcare is something that is incredibly dangerous, frankly, because a lot of what that we're now seeing in terms of behavioural problems, learning difficulties, emotional problems with young people is because they've never had that early years of grounding, which instinctively are so important. So, yes, parents must do more. Some would find that very difficult because the cost of living means they have to have two incomes. But whether the government can do anything to ameliorate that, they're not even trying. In fact, they're just making it worse. The other issue here is that even in affluent areas where I live and where my daughter taught primary school, parents, for whatever reason, have abrogated their responsibility. Now, whether it's stranger danger, road safety, wellness, it goes on and on. They now want the teachers and the schools to do all of that. So teachers are having to become counsellors, welfare workers, and parents no longer respect the teachers either, and that's an issue. Where a lot of teachers are finding that they can't really discipline the child or say the child is disruptive or isn't learning because the parents will always take the child's side against the teacher. So it's becoming more and more complicated. Uh, Teaching has a very high attrition rate. That's something we haven't spoken about, but it's getting worse every year, especially in Victoria, but also New South Wales after the lockdowns, where in Victoria schools were shut for 2 or 3 terms. Since then, a lot of teachers have resigned, so we have a very high attrition rate. And often they say it's because of misbehaviour. Students are not learning, they're not willing to learn. They've come from home not respecting authority, not being willing to learn. Frankly, it's interesting, people don't want to talk about it again. The only difference are with Asian parents, where there's a very strong education ethic. And I'm in Melbourne. I went to Melbourne High School back in the day. When I was there in 68, 69, it was a lot of Anglo, Greek, Italian, Australian kids, Jewish kids. Melbourne High is now about 97% Chinese or Indian because it's a selective high school. So it's fascinating. In the latest TIMS results that came out a couple of weeks ago, Australian students, especially boys, did better. The reason why the standard lifted was because we had more and more students performing at the top level. Nobody's made the point that most of those students are Asian. So it's quite interesting that, and I've written about this, and Lee Kuan Yew many years ago talked about Australia becoming the white trash of Asia. But this is another issue that people don't want to address, as I keep saying. But to get back to parenting, parenting's crucial. Parents must be responsible. They're their children's primary caregivers and moral guardians. And I'll leave you with this, that in Ireland there was a referendum looking at the original constitution in the Republic of Ireland, which said women should be mothers and caregivers, and the government should do all it can to help women stay at home. And that was passed or reaffirmed. So imagine trying that in Australia.
Earlier today, you've talked about the fact that not everyone needs to go to university, but we've created this environment, this culture where higher ed degrees are expected when you're applying for the most basic job. So I'd like to ask you about vocational education. Specifically, what role do you see for vocational education in addressing the skills mismatch in a workforce? And how do you think it should be integrated into the school curriculum?
Yeah, I mean, those who are old like me, who went to school during the sort of 60s, will remember there were technical schools. So, pretty well across Australia, we had in secondary school, you either, once you finished primary school, you either went to a technical school or to a high school. Within the high school, where I went, Broadmeadows High School, for the first 4 years, we were streamed. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing. A lot of kids actually left at year 10. So back then, very few stayed on to year 12 and did high school certificate. Very few went on to university. A lot left at year 10 in the high school and went into work, an apprenticeship, whatever it might be. A lot also went to the technical school at year 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and they became tradies. So they became sparkies or plumbers or builders, whatever it might be. Part of during the Dawkins era under Gough Whitlam, but also under Joan Kerner when she was in Victoria, technical schools were abolished. So then every student had to go to a high school, a secondary school, and every student had to do what was supposedly an academic general curriculum. So there wasn't any pathway for different abilities or skills or motivations and so they were all sort of channeled up to year 11 and 12. At year 11 and 12, they've tried to address the issue of having what I'll call VET, vocational education and training subjects. So at year 11 and 12 now, there is a pathway where you don't have to do the academic side and go to university. You can do a trade side, and that's well and good. The problem is it doesn't start early enough. If I had my way, it would start at year 10. So you might say there's a general education for all kids up to year 4, but then certainly year 11 and 12, they go into a technical stream, which is what they do in Europe, in most countries, whether it's Germany or Italy, or they have that different pathways. The reason why over the last 20 years we've had to import all these tradies and we've had the school shortage is because we've forgotten that not everybody wants to go through that same pathway to year 11 and 12 that supposedly is academic. A lot of boys in particular want to do a trade. So how do you resolve that? That's a real issue. We've played at the edges. Labor and Liberal governments federally have put money into starting up senior technical colleges. But the problem is the bureaucracy at the state and territory level doesn't really want that. They are not interested in that diversity. They tend to want to control and maintain what it is that they've already established. The reason why we've suffered academically in terms of standards over the last 40, 50 years is because all the academics responsible for it and all the bureaucrats, whether it's the ACARA or AXA, the curriculum body, whether it's the AATE, the English teachers, all the people who have been managing that in the last 4 or 5 years were the very ones who created the problem 30 years ago. It's very rare that someone will admit their mistakes because a lot of academics have built their careers on it. So if you've built your career as an English academic saying we must have critical literacy, we must deconstruct and we must have whole language and we must empower, and you're not suddenly going to say, oh, gee, I got all that wrong. And what tends to happen, and I've written about this, you might know the expression, the industrial sort of complex in Australia, the sort of industrial complex. So if you go way back, the ACTU and the Industrial Commission were kind of like hand in hand. They all knew one another. All the appointees to the commission generally came from the trade union movement. So it was like a captured body where they all agreed. They all were really only about self-preservation. Education has been like that for 40 or 50 years. So if you look at all the peak organisations, whether it's the National Teachers Union, the AEU, whether it's the AATE, the English teachers, whether it's the AITSL or ACARA, the bodies responsible for teacher training and curriculum, or whether it's ACARA, as I said, often they're all the same people and they simply wear different hats from year to year. And I wrote about this about 15, 20 years ago, where I could name maybe 8 people, 10 people, who have controlled education, school education, in Australia over the last 40, 50 years, and who are responsible for the mess, generally all promoted on the Peter principle that when they get it wrong in one job, they're then promoted to another job higher up where they repeat the same mistakes. So it's all very depressing in a sense. And for years now, I've argued for charter schools and school vouchers and to try and free up the market and to get, a more market driven approach.
Let's talk about technology in education. With your views on traditional education, how do you reconcile the need for technology in classrooms? What's your vision, if you have one, for technology's role in future education?
Yeah, I mean, about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I wrote about technology and I quoted Silicon Valley, where a lot of the top executives in the high, those companies, whether it was Microsoft or Apple or whatever it was, a lot of them didn't have computers at home for their children. And a lot of them sent their schools to alternative schools, I'll call them, Steiner, Montessori, where there was no technology, where the kids would learn to catch a ball, throw and catch a ball, build something, use a hammer and nail, craft something, use paints, where there was no technology because even though these people were at the highest levels in Silicon Valley, they realised the danger. And to use the expression, it's a Pandora's box. Now, most people know, well, the Pandora's box, again, that's cultural literacy. A lot of people would have no idea what I'm talking about. But you can have something good, like Kevin Rudd, when he was Prime Minister, talked about computers as the toolbox of the future. And he and his government put millions and millions and millions of dollars into connecting schools to the network, to the digital network, to the internet, getting laptops into schools. It's interesting when you look at the international testing, TIMSS and PISA, the countries that outperform Australia over the last 20 years have not put the focus on technology. What they put the focus on is on teachers teaching, kids learning. And often that means rote learning, memorisation, challenging students with difficult concepts, difficult subject matter, especially in primary school. Technology is a double edged sword. I mean, we're using technology now, obviously. I've been at the Catholic University the last 11 years, and all the research I do, basically 95% of it is computer based. And it's an incredibly helpful resource. I mean, I can talk to you, I can talk to people anywhere in the world. I can download, there's a great clearinghouse in America on education where I can go online, type in a subject, get peer reviewed journals, which aren't always good, but you can access all of this. I think I stole it from T.S. Eliot, but I've written that information is not knowledge and understanding is not wisdom. So information is not knowledge, understanding is not wisdom. To me, when I talk about enculturation, education should be about knowledge and wisdom. You can have the technology, fine, but I wouldn't be using it in primary school. I'd probably get rid of it totally. You might start using it in secondary school, but I'd be very careful how you used it. And if I was a parent, and parents, I think there was a book by Jonathan Haidt just recently about the dangers of technology, and we've known about this for a long time. I wouldn't be allowing kids to have any technology in the bedroom. I'd have dinner around the table, turn everything off, actually talk to one another. So technology is an issue, and again, there's a lot of cognitive research. There's an English woman from Oxford. I'll think of a name in a minute, who toured Australia 15, 20 years ago, and said, and the research now shows this to be true, putting children, especially 8 or 10 or 12 or 14, in front of a screen, to use a colloquialism, it fries their brain. And actually, their neural networks are shattered. And that's why we're having a lot of kids who can't concentrate when they get to year 8, year 9, year 10. I'm told by year 12 teachers to ask a kid to read Jane Austen or Patrick White or David Malouf. They can't read a novel because they're just incapable of sitting still for 30, 40 minutes reading the printed word. So I would be very strong on not using technology. Uh, it has its place, but I'd be very careful.
In your work, your essays, your keynotes, and your books, you have been quite vocal about the role of choice in education. You've briefly talked about this today as well. I'd love to find out from you what policy changes specifically would you advocate for to ensure that both private and public educational systems contribute effectively to national educational goals?
Yeah, there's an issue there, isn't it? I mean, the last 20, 30 years, we've had a series of, and this is exactly what you're asking, we've had a series of national reform agreements, generally pushed by the federal government, because they control the purse strings. The federal government really has all the money when it comes to education. Now, the states control schools, but their funding, they rely on federal money. So what we've had over the last 15, as I said, 20, 30 years, are these national reform agreements every 3 or 4 years. There was a very good Auditor General's report earlier this year that basically concluded they'd achieved nothing in terms of raising standards or getting more value for money. So it's just a mind zapping sort of example of bureaucracy and politicians spending billions and billions of dollars on all these carefully crafted national reform agreements where there are KPIs and indicators and hundreds of pages, key points, key milestones. And they feel great. Look at that. We're going to make it all better. Why? Because we've got agreement. So all the states and territories have to sign up to it. And then they all say, good, let's come back in 4 years. And as I say, the Auditor General said it's achieved very little, if anything. So I'm very wary. I'm not big on bureaucrats or government intrusion. And there was a very good national review by a guy, Caldwell, who said one of the greatest problems principals face, school principals, is they're responsible to two levels of government: state, federal, or state and territory and federal. And principals spend most of their time answering dictates from on high. Health and safety, financial accountability, curriculum responsibility, assessment data. And teachers are spending most of their time checklists, filling in forms. So I've always argued you've got to free this up somehow. And there is a lot of good research overseas and I know people will, counter the argument, but that charter schools and school vouchers, freeing it up, giving schools greater flexibility and autonomy is effective. It is a good way to raise standards. Now, that doesn't mean you have a free for all. I mean, education's a multi-billion dollar business. And, school fees can be $38,000 a year, which is crazy. So, as I said before, there's got to be some way, hopefully, of getting it right. The balance between autonomy at the local level, what Catholics call subsidiarity, and some kind of umbrella of accountability. Uh, national reform agreements. So what? You can. I was at a meeting earlier in the year where we talked about this, and we had all the educational leaders in one room, and I said, "Well, isn't this wonderful? We spent all day formulating the next national reform agreement when none of them over the last 30 years have improved anything. And if we're here in 4 years' time, we'll have the same problems." But it's a great way of politicians and bureaucrats reinventing themselves. And I think trying to maintain their relevance.
To me, it's seriously depressing that people in charge are preoccupied with maintaining their relevance instead of optimizing for outcomes or making space for people who know how to do that. Mr. Donnelly, I'm mindful of the time as we come in close to the end of this interview, so let's wrap up with two last questions. I want to ask you about moral and ethical education. How do you think schools should incorporate moral and ethical education into their curriculum?
I mean, again, a good question, and I've written and thought about this quite a lot. And there are a couple of issues here. If the curriculum is, whether it's history or literature or music or art, if it's all relativistic and subjective, it's up to you to decide what's right and wrong or what you enjoy or don't enjoy. So let's play Mozart or Bach. Let's read Shakespeare's Macbeth or whatever. It's up to you. You can decide. If you hate it, well, obviously it's rubbish. So there's kind of this subjectivism. There's also this kind of relativism that, in English at year 12, everything is a text. So Dostoevsky or whoever it might be, Jane Austen or Orwell, graffiti on a wall or SMS messaging or a poster for a movie, they're all texts and they're all to be analysed and deconstructed. So you've lost any sense of the text having some inherent value. Okay, some inherent value, just my wife there. And really that destroys what I call one of the fundamental purposes of education when I talk about enculturation. And it goes back, obviously, to people like Oakeshott and Roger Scruton and T.S. Eliot Matthew Arnold and others who I've mentioned. And it goes back, Cardinal Newman or St. Newman talked about the ideal of a university. And in that, he talks about a liberal education, which is what I'm most in favour of. And what he talks about is a liberal education is about character. So you want to imbue young people with a sense of character. And that goes back to the Greeks, that the idea of virtues. Now, whether it's honesty, integrity, courage, love, understanding truth, all of those virtues go back to the Greeks, but also to Catholic theologians like Saint Newman. We've lost all of that. Let me tell you, as we say, even in some religious schools, we've lost it, and so that's a real problem. So I've always argued that a good education, school education, has to be intellectually rigorous, academically rigorous. It has to be morally grounded. So you have to teach young kids what is right and what is wrong, what constitutes good and bad behaviour, how to judge what is true and what is false. And it also has to be emotionally and spiritually enriching. So a sense of the aesthetic, the sublime, the sense of there being something more than just self. The problem is the last 50 years, education has gone totally the other way. So it's all about child-centred learning, about student agency, about collaborative negotiated goal setting, about subjectivism, relativism, about there being no truth. Nothing's true. It's all relative. The irony is, except when it comes to gender theory or climate change or misogyny or white supremacy, then they argue everything they're saying is true. And if you don't believe it, you're a deplorable, if you know what I mean. So there's a real danger here in the West. And, you know, I keep referring to people like Roger Scruton and Augustin Del Noce. And there was a very good Pierre Rickman, who was an academic sinologist, study specialist in China, originally from Belgium, who taught at the ANU and then Sydney. I mean, he's written about this a lot. He's dead now. But whether it was Harold Bloom in America all those years ago, whether it's Roger Scruton in England, whether it's people like Rickman, Pierre Rickman in Australia, they have all argued, as many others have, that universities have long since dropped, ignored, given up any sense of teaching what is most valuable and most necessary. And that's where I come back to the importance of culture. And I don't know if you've seen the cover, I'll send you the cover. I've just edited a book published, Defend the West, The Culture of Freedom, which I think I told you about. I wrote one about 5 years ago for the IPA, Culture of Freedom, but this is a new book which has only just been published. And in that book, Paul Morrissey talks about the origins of Western culture. Colin Black, the headmaster, who I know and respect, has written about a liberal education. And another author has written about the move to classical liberal schools in Australia and elsewhere. So we're at a very fraught time historically, and you might know. I'm thinking, ARC, the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. They had a big conference in London earlier this year. They had one in Sydney that I went to about a month ago. They're having another one in London. And John Anderson, who was Deputy Prime Minister and leader of the National Party, is helping to set that up. And he and others argue that we are really at, to use the cliche, a tipping point where in Western societies, the danger is we've lost the plot, to put it simply. Now, whether it's, you know, the rise of, in Australia, very high rates of youth suicide, self-harm, anxiety, depression. We have one of the highest rates of alcohol and drug abuse, especially ice, all these sort of party drugs. If you look at all the social indicators, society's fallen apart. And that's happening in many states in America, in parts of England, in Europe, Germany, France. Some of the suburbs you won't go to because they're too dangerous. Now, I've always argued, and this is another sort of conversation at some stage, the expression culture is upstream of politics has become widespread. People talk about that. That if you're trying to talk about politics and what should be done, you need to look at more broadly the culture of society and what the issues are. And I argue education is upstream of both. And President Abraham Lincoln, who again, this is cultural literacy, 99% of young people wouldn't know who he was or what happened when he was president, the Civil War. But Lincoln said the philosophy of the classroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next. So, to my mind, and I suppose it's my area of expertise, so I'm biased, I'd argue education is crucial, absolutely critical. And unless we get it right in the next 5, 8 years, yeah, it's going to be difficult, very difficult. And it's interesting. I know parents who talk about the global reset and what happened during COVID, and a lot of those people are going bush, setting up their own schools, and really setting up enclaves where they feel we have to start defending what we value and getting ready for what might happen in another 5, 10 years. And a perfect example of that was what happened in Victoria during COVID, where it was Orwellian. It was 1984, and I've written about this quite a lot. That the then Premier Daniel Andrews, who I called Dictator Dan, totally totalitarian, self-centred, arrogant, egotistical, prorogued Parliament, destroyed any sense of the Westminster parliamentary system and cabinet solidarity, used the police to enforce a draconian regime of where people were shot, pepper sprayed. Uh, it was appalling. People were locked in their homes. And there's a very, it surprised a lot of people because we always knew it happened under fascism or communism or under Mao or Lenin. But a lot of people suddenly realised, oh my God, this is happening in Victoria, in Melbourne, only 3, 4 years ago. So I don't want to end on a gloomy note, but, there are significant issues here. The problem is in education, most politicians aren't aware of it. And most bureaucrats, if they are, don't care. So most politicians will talk, oh yeah, back to basics, explicit teaching. We need to raise standards. It's not about money. Then you actually say, well, what is it about?
Would it be fair to say that our societal moral compass is out of order because we have elevated tolerance as their highest value? Obviously, it's worth mentioning that pretending to be tolerant, talking about one's tolerance virtues in case of a government or an institution is really not the same as being tolerant. I suppose tolerance became yet another word with inverted meaning in our present day and age.
Again, that's a good conversation to have. We haven't talked about the Frankfurt School in Germany during the 1920s, 1930s, where a number of academics started. They realised that the revolution was never going to occur in the West. So when you look at the Frankfurt School, the academics were all Marxist. They argued and they realised the revolution was not going to occur unless we took over the institutions. And so I mentioned Althusser and the ideological state apparatus. Antonio Gramsci, the Italian before then, had talked about cultural hegemony or hegemony. So what the cultural Marxists believe is the way to bring about the revolution is to take the long march through the institutions, which was an expression made famous by the German activist Rudi Dutschke during the 60s. One of the academics was Marcuse, Herbert Marcuse. He wrote a very good essay you might know of, and if you haven't, you should read it, and your listeners should read it, all about intolerance. So Herbert Marcuse, all about intolerance. And basically what he argued is that if you want to bring about the revolution, the only way to be tolerant was to be intolerant. So the cultural Marxism, and that became part of political correctness about woke, Black Lives Matter, all of that sort of rainbow alliance. They argued to be tolerant, to achieve the perfect utopia where tolerance was supreme, we have to be intolerant. So I've been at a forum talking with other people, and the young woman looked at me and said, "You're male, pale, and stale." And I said, "Pardon?" I've been at other meetings or online where people will attack me as a white supremacist or a Catholic pedophile. So we've got to a stage, and it's kind of Orwellian, like freedom is slavery, war is peace, ignorance is strength, tolerance is intolerance. So the cultural left and Marcuse argued that, as I said, to bring about the revolution, it's okay to be intolerant. You can banish people, you can sack them, you can no platform them, you can do anything to shut them up. Because what they're saying, even though it might be perfectly reasonable and rational, is wrong. So it's okay to be intolerant. I mean, that's one thing. I don't know if I answered your question. The other thing is, and I think that's the greatest problem, frankly, and some authors have written that. I'll think of her name, and there's a famous American feminist. I'll think of her name if I can, but she argues this point, as did George Orwell in 1984, that we've now reached a stage of mind control and groupthink. I mean, tolerance is a good thing. The other argument, I suppose, in education during the 70s and 80s, it was kind of strange because education became therapeutic. It was education like a therapy. It's about your feelings. So I and others have written, education used to be about I think, therefore I am. Now it's I feel, empathy. If I'm talking to you, I lean in. I share with you, all this jargon. So in that sense, maybe that therapy, that kind of sense of everybody being tolerant because it's all about valuing who we feel we are, that's there. But I think the main point would be for me that tolerance is now intolerance.
I want to be respectful of your time, as we did run over by at least 25 minutes, and you have been very generous continuing to provide answers to at times not particularly well formulated questions. I wanted to have you on as you have a lifetime of experience with the educational system, and I think your diagnosis, despite representing a part of a larger equation, can lead to very high quality, actionable insights and real change. Actionable insight is where we need to get to, and that's what this show is all about. Thank you very much for your time today, Mr. Donnelly. This was very insightful and I really enjoyed it.
No problem.
Well, there you have it. I hope you've enjoyed this interview with Kevin Donnelly, who I believe did an excellent job of diagnosing issues within Australia's education system and articulating the negative trends affecting both schools and universities. The question isn't whether Australia has capable students, because it clearly does. The issue is that their education system no longer rewards or prioritizes academic excellence in a way it once did. Instead, excellence is now achieved in spite of the system, rather than because of it. This shift indicates a systemic problem where the structures and incentives in place are not aligned with fostering academic achievement, suggesting a need for reform to realign the system's goals with its outcomes. It's very important to clarify that the insights and the criticism discussed in this podcast are really not aimed at individual teachers. Teachers are great. The vast majority are caring professionals trying to do a good job within a system that, like the medical system, can sometimes feel captured by broader systemic forces beyond their control. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with an interesting thought from Stafford Beer, who once said, "The purpose of a system is what it does." This means that regardless what we claim the education system's purpose to be, its true purpose is reflected in what it actually achieves. If there are systemic issues leading to negative outcomes, then those outcomes define the system's purpose, not the well-intentioned efforts of those within it. If you find Kevin's work interesting and relevant, please do try to support him. Go to his website, kevindonnelly.com.au, and check out his books, particularly Defend the West, The Culture of Freedom, and Wake Up to Woke, It's Time Australia. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.